think all of us probably know that our humanity and the weakness that the human flesh carries with it causes us temptation and also can cause us all kinds of problems. Sometimes when we read about people within God's Word, extraordinary godly men and women, I think sometimes it comes as a surprise when we read about them doing something wrong. And you know, it's always hard for us to imagine these great men and women, you know, allowing sin to overtake them. But I think if we've learned anything in these last couple of series that we've looked at the life of Abraham, and now we're looking at the life of David, is that even though they were very godly men, there were times when they didn't do what was right. There were times when they violated God's law and fell away from God's will for them in this life. And that's exactly what we're going to study and read about this morning in 1 Samuel chapter 27. If you have your Bibles, pick it up and turn over there with me. 1 Samuel chapter 27. And we're going to read about how David, for a time, gave in to doubt, and actually he lived a life that was very deceptive. He lived a life that was really based upon a lie, and find him on a regular occasion telling lies. And so we want to study that and kind of talk about what we can learn from that and how we can learn from that example of David in the Scripture. Now remember that David, for about 7 years, and as I say these things this morning, I'm not trying to excuse what David did. I just think that is easy to understand as a human being. But when you study the last 7 years, we've been looking at the life of David and how he's been involved in running away from Saul. You know, those are probably some of the most distressing circumstances that a person could live in. Could you imagine this morning living in the United States of America and the President of the United States of America is trying to hunt you down and kill you? I mean, that would be alarming, wouldn't it? That would be some pretty stressful times and conditions, but that's exactly the situation that David was living in. He never knew when Saul was going to be around the next corner or when Saul was going to mount another army to send out after him. And so he was under a lot of pressure. He was under some very distressing circumstances, and that weighed heavily upon David. And I think what that resulted in was probably one of the most stressful and tension-filled lives that you'll read about in the Bible. And so again, I'm pointing these things out not to excuse what David did, but to kind of understand them from a human perspective. And you know, that all that strain and all that distress, I think, finally took its toll on David, and he kind of fell into a mindset of desperation. He kind of fell into a mindset of discouragement. And he began to doubt in God and some of the promises that God had made to him. And so that distrust gave birth to about 1.5 years, actually 1 year and 4 months, where he lived very deceptively in the land of the enemy. And so we're going to talk about this flight that David takes to the foreign country of Philistia and how he let doubt creep into his mind and what we can learn from that in studying. The first thing that I want to point out in this particular chapter is that doubt often leads to distrust in numerous declarations. You'll see this in the life of David. You know, David begins to lose confidence and trust in some of the things that God has declared to him, and also in some of the things that his friends have declared to him, and even his enemies had declared to him. And so when we lose confidence in what somebody says, you know, when we think, well, I can't really trust that what they're telling me is going to happen, then certainly we're going to doubt and we're going to distrust some of the things that they say to us. Notice in verse 1, it says, "And David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines. And Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel, so shall I escape out of his hand." Now, think about how confident David has been up to this point. And think about last week how we were reading about how, you know, David once again had snuck into the camp and he'd taken Saul's spear and he's taken his water jug and
Saul has professed that he's in the wrong. He's invited David to come back and live in his homeland. And David, I don't discredit him for not trusting Saul, because he learned by experience you couldn't trust what Saul said. But I do want to point out his line of thinking. And he jumps to this hasty conclusion. He says, if I don't run away to a foreign land, one day Saul's going to kill me. I'm going to die by the hand of Saul. Now think about how many times, and we've read about several occasions where it looks like David is just in the grasp of Saul, yet God intervenes, and God delivers him from the hand of Saul. And so what has caused David to think that God's, whenever Saul's going to get close, that God isn't going to interpose once again? What has caused him to think that through all these situations, God has guarded him and watched over him and protected him, but now all of a sudden God's going to fail him? He's no longer going to do that. And what in his mind thinks, if I run to the country of Israel's sworn enemy, I'll be safe? That's almost illogical thinking on the part of David. But that's exactly the mindset that he adopted. And so let me remind you of some of the declarations. Of course, you have the declaration of God that's given to David himself in 2 Samuel 7, 13 and 14. You can read about that there. But you also have David from time to time reminding himself, I'm not going to die, I'm going to become king of Israel. Remember in 1 Samuel chapter 26 and verse 10, when David again was in the camp of Saul and his nephew was trying to persuade him to stick that spear in Saul's head. And you remember what David said there? He said, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his days shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. Here you have this great confidence and faith and trust of David. God is going to take care of Saul. But now all of a sudden he says, if I don't get out of here, Saul's going to kill me. If I don't run down and live in the land of the enemy, my day is going to come. What about the words of Jonathan, Saul's son? You remember in 1 Samuel 20 and verse 15, he told David, they made that covenant together, and he said, thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one of them, from the face of the earth. God is going to take care of your enemies, and Jonathan knew that included his father Saul. You have the words of Abigail. You might remember in 1 Samuel chapter 20 and about verse 30, it says, it shall come to pass when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning thee, and shall have appointed thee ruler over Israel. Did Abigail believe that David was going to die? That Saul was going to kill him? No. She believed that David was going to become the king of Israel himself. You even have the words of Saul on numerous occasions. Saul declared to David that he knows in his heart, in his mind, that he's going to be the next king of Israel. In fact, in 1 Samuel 24 and verse 20, he says, and now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. The last chapter that we studied last week, 1 Samuel 26 and verse 25, Saul says to David, blessed be thou, my son David, thou shalt do both great things and shalt still prevail. Now keep in mind here again, God himself has told David that you're going to be king of Israel. I'm going to take care of Saul. You have Jonathan telling him, you're going to be the next king of Israel. You have Saul himself, the man who has sworn to kill him. I know you're going to be the next king of Israel. You have Abigail telling him, you're going to be the next king of Israel. You have times where David is saying to others, God has appointed me as the next king of Israel. So how is it that David has suddenly shifted from that mindset to I've got to run away, or else Saul is going to kill me and I'm not going to be the next king of Israel? Well, it's because he doubted the things that God said. He doubted the other declarations that were made to him by Jonathan and by Saul and by Abigail. And that's what doubt does. Doubt causes us to ignore very plain statements that are given to us in God's Word. When we start losing confidence in something that God says, we start doubting and distrusting. And I think that's the situation that David found himself in. Notice in verse 2. And David arose, and he passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Maach, king of Gath. And David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, even David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife. And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. You know, despite God's assurance and everybody else's declaration about David being king, that pressure, I think, of being pursued for nearly 7 years forced him to retreat into the land of the enemy, forced him to withdraw deeper into the wilderness. And again, from a human standpoint, I think I can understand that and appreciate it. Well, I can't fully appreciate and understand it because I've never been in that situation, but just thinking logically, I can understand why David might do such. Imagine every day that you woke up, your life was in danger. That's how David had lived for 7 years. And not only that, but he had this pressure. Remember the 600 men that were along with him. He had this pressure of providing for them on a daily basis. And I know we only read about the men, but if they were like David, they had families too. They had a wife, they had children. And so we may be talking in excess of 2,000 people that David was in charge of taking care of. And again, I think he let the weight and the pressure and the strain and the stress of all those things overcome him. It just became too much for him to deal with. And so what happened? He began to doubt. And when you begin to doubt, you let that distrust creep into our lives. So he goes to King Achish, who is the king of the Philistines. Now again, remember, this is the arch enemy of Israel that he's going to. He goes to the king of the Philistines, Achish, and he asks permission for him and his group of men to live there. Well, you might remember this story because that's what he did in the very beginning. Whenever Saul was pursuing David in the very beginning, he runs to the Philistine nation. He tries to blend in with them and live among them, seeking protection. And remember what happened. Some of the king's counselors said, hey, remember who this guy is. Remember that he's killed numerous Philistines. And he's not your friend, he's your enemy. And so remember, David had to act crazy. He had to act like, had to let drool run down, drip on his beard. And he had to take a stick and scrabble on the wall to pretend like he was crazy so they wouldn't kill him. So he's tried this before and it didn't work. Somebody might say, well, why did it work this time? Because it's 7 years later. And now this king knows that David is the arch enemy of King Saul. In the beginning, I don't think he understood everything, but now he sees how much he is hated. Now he sees how he's being pursued by his own nation. His own brethren are betraying him. And so now I think there's this idea of trust that exists between them. Saul is threatening him every day, and he's welcome into this Philistine camp, into the city of the king himself, and he's allowed to settle in Gath. And the result was what? The result was what David wanted. And that was for 1 year and 4 months, Saul didn't bother him anymore because he's living in the land of the enemy. There's no way that Saul can, just run into the capital of the enemy and grab David and run out of there. The reason that he only lasted 1 year and 4 months is because Saul dies after the end of that. And then he gets to come back to Israel. But he is allowed to settle there. He's no longer pursued. And you have to stop and question, is this really the best choice that he has? To go and live with the enemy and seek the protection of the enemy? Or would he have been better off just living where he was, letting God protect him and take care of him like he'd done for the last 7 years? And here, again, we have this idea, well, what does distrust do? Distrust causes David to kind of plan out his own life and map his own direction. What do I need to do? Where do I need to go? Who do I need to be friends with? And you notice in verse 5, it says, David says unto Achish, if I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? Then Achish gave him Ziklag that day, wherefore Ziklag pertaineth unto the kings of Judah unto this day. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months. Well, what does David do? David decides, I can't live here with the king. I've got to live somewhere else. I've got to get out from under the eye of the king. And so he goes to the king and he asks him, will you give us a place that we can live on our own? You know, there's no need for us and 600 men and probably 2,000 people in excess living here in the capital, you relying upon you taking care of us. Let us go out here, give us a place where we can go out here and we can take care of ourselves. Well, the king thought that's probably a good idea, you know, put a little more money in his pocket, and so he gave him the city of Ziklag, and that's where he goes and lives for a year and 4 months. Now, again, I want to emphasize the problem with this is David is, you know, he's mapping out his own way. He's making up his own direction for his life. And Jeremiah, you probably are familiar, remember the words of Jeremiah in Jeremiah 10 and verse 23. He said, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his own steps. Do you realize what Jeremiah is saying there? When we stop following the path that God has mapped out for us, the direction that God has for us in this life, then we start making our own map. And we start going our own way and mapping our own direction that we're going to make out in life. And so usually when that happens, probably all of us have been guilty of that from time to time, right? Do things go great? No. I mean, think about Abraham. That God had this great plan mapped out for him to have his one and only son Isaac. And then Abraham and Sarah decide we need to take matters into our own hands. And you need to marry Hagar, and you need to have a son by her, and we're going to go in this direction. And you know what happened? It messed things up, didn't it? And it messed things up in a big way. A lot of conflict that's still going on in the world today is because of that decision. But that's usually what happens when we abort God's plan for us and His direction for us, and we kind of map out our own way in the life. That's going to just mess things up, and it's going to lead to more problems, which we probably don't anticipate. But when we are under pressure, just like David was, you know, when we're stressed out, when we're facing these perplexing circumstances, that's when doubt and distrust often creep into the picture. And if we don't stay on this path that God has for us, if we don't walk in this direction that God gives us, then there's a great chance that we're going to mess things up by taking our own direction. You know, I couldn't help but think about the story of the children of Israel in inheriting the land of Canaan. The Hebrew writer mentions it at least a couple of times in the book of Hebrews. But remember why he said they didn't get to enter in? Remember, God told them, you can overcome these people. You can win the battles. You can beat the giants. You can conquer these fortified cities. I'll be with you. I'll fight for you and you'll win. But when it actually came down to doing it, they just wouldn't do it, right? They didn't believe what God said. They didn't have enough trust and confidence in what God said was going to happen. And so in verse 18 of Hebrews chapter 3, it says, And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but them that believe not? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. You know, another word for unbelief, doubt, distrust. Why is it? What caused it? What kept God's children from entering into the promised land, the land of rest in the Old Testament? It was unbelief. It was distrust. It was a lack of confidence in what God told them. And that same example is used for us today. As God's children today, we can't allow a lack of faith to keep us from doing what God says. We can't allow a lack of faith to move us to map out our own place or our own direction in life. Because if we do, we're going to miss out on the promised land. We're going to miss out on that land of rest, just like God's Israel of old. The lesson that we learn is we should never doubt. We should never distrust the promises of God. That's easy to say, I know, from the pulpit. But when you're under stress and pressure and the difficult circumstances of life, it's a lot harder to perform. The second thing that I want to emphasize about doubt is doubt often leads us deeper into sin. And you see that in the reaction of David here. Notice in verse 8 of 1 Samuel 27. David and his men went up and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites, for those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. And David smote the land, and left neither man nor woman alive, and took away the sheep and the oxen and the donkeys and the camels and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. Now, what happened because David doubted? Well, do you think this was a life that he imagined he would live here in the land of the Philistines? I doubt it. But what happened because he had doubted God? He got himself down in this country, and he got under the eye of this king, and so he had to live very deceptively. The first thing that he knew as he was living there is, I can't keep here under the eye of this king, or I'm going to get caught doing something I shouldn't get caught, or shouldn't be doing, and I'm going to be punished because of it. And so he says, why don't you give us a place that we can call our own? So the king gives him that city of Ziklag. And so while he and his followers are in this city, we read about them carrying out some what we would probably label military operations. You know, here he is out in this isolated city, this isolated country. And because he's kind of away from the eye of the king, he's able to do things under the radar, so to speak. And so what do we read about him doing? We read about him conducting these raids on these different groups of people. And I mean, you read about the raids. I'm not going to go into the right or wrong of them, but you can study that on your own. But it's brutal savagery. I mean, he goes into a city and he kills all the men, he kills all the women, he kills all the children. Then they take all the stuff, all the clothes, all the money, all the animals, all the possessions, and they bring it back with them. Well, somebody might say, why were they doing that? Support. I mean, they had to support themselves somewhat. And David, to kind of keep things, you know, good with the king, he would give the king a cut of everything that he would take. So he'd come back and he'd say, well, here's your part that I brought back for you in all these spoils. So they plundered these foreign cities and their territories, and they gave Achish his portion, or a portion of it, as his reward. Now notice in verse 10, it says, and Achish said, whither have ye made a road today? And David said, against the south of Judah, and against the south of Jerahmeelites, and against the south of the Kenites. And David saved neither man nor woman alive to bring tidings to Gath, saying, lest they should tell on us, saying, so did David, and so will be his manner all the while he dwelleth in the country of the Philistines. And Achish believed David, saying, he hath made his people Israel utterly to abhor him, therefore he shall be my servant forever. What did this doubt lead David to do? Well, again, to live very deceptively and really to try to dupe others into believing that he was doing something different than what he was. Now, we read about the king here, and when David would come to him and give him a portion of these things, the king would say, well, where did you get all these things from? You know what David would say? From the Israelites. I went into my own country, you know, and I fought against the south of Judah, and I fought against the Kenites, and fought against these people, and we conquered them, and we brought all these things back from them. The problem was David was doing exactly the opposite of what he was telling the king he was doing. He was going out there for these people who were friends, not enemies, but friends with the Philistines, and he was conquering them. And the reason that he was killing everybody is so that nobody could bring a different report back to the king, so that the king wouldn't find out really where David was fighting and where he was getting all these things from. When he implemented that policy of elimination, he was in essence saying, you know, if no one survives, then no one's ever going to tell the truth. No one's going to ever know the truth besides us. The problem with that is it's known in the Bible as lying, right? That's easy to understand. I know a lot of people will say, well, David was in difficult circumstances. Hey, I already said that. He was. But he flat out lied. I mean, he was so deceptive for that year and 4 months, and he was constantly lying to the king and probably to his officials about what was going on and what he was really doing and what was taking place. And it's interesting to me that David wrote this verse in the book of Psalms. In Psalms 101 and verse 7, he says, "He that worketh deceit shall not dwell within my house. He that telleth lies shall not tarry in my sight." You know how David felt about deception and liars? He hated it. And in fact, he made that statement. He said, a person who is working deceit is not going to live in my house. Why would he not want a deceptive person living in his house? The same reason that we wouldn't want a deceptive person living in our house. Because you never know what they're up to. You never know what their plans are. You never know ultimately what they're trying to do or what they're trying to accomplish. And then he talks about the person who tarries or tells lies will not be allowed within my sight. David said, I don't even want to look at a liar, much less hear a liar. David didn't like lying, but yet that's the very situation that he was in. Now, if David, think about those statements that he made. If he felt that strongly about lying, how do you think God feels about it? You know, we don't have to wonder when it comes to God's feelings or commandments concerning the idea of deception or lying in the Scripture. In fact, in Proverbs 7, or chapter 12 and verse 22, the wise man wrote, "Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight." Proverbs 6:16 through 19 talks about these 6 things doth the Lord hate. Yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. One of those things is a lying tongue. I've mentioned that word abomination before. You know, we don't really have a great word in the English language that reflects just how deep the feelings against that sin are. We would say God hates it, but that's not even a strong enough word. God absolutely despises lying. He loathes it. He's like David. I don't want to see a liar. I don't want to hear a liar. Nobody who tells a lie is going to dwell with me. And so we don't have to wonder about what God feels when it comes to that particular area. In fact, if you study the New Testament, Acts chapter 5, remember the story of Ananias and Sapphira. That pretty well answers the question, what does God think about lying? You know, we often say, well, they were destroyed because they told an untruth, and they did, but the emphasis that's given in that passage in verse 4, remember it says, "Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God." That's what was so bad. God hates lying. It's an abomination unto him. He utterly despises it. It's absolutely loathsome to him. I don't want to see a liar. I don't want to hear a liar. I don't want to live with a liar. And that's why Ananias and Sapphira died. In Revelation chapter 21 and verse 8, we're probably given one of the most severe warnings that's given in the Bible. But you might remember it says, "The fearful and the unbelieving and abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." That's a severe warning, isn't it? But think about that category of people that God puts lying in. Murderers, fornicators, people who practice witchcraft or sorcery, people who worship idols, and all liars. You know, the problem with distrust and doubt is it often leads us deeper into sin. That's what it did for David. The deeper sin that it led him into, or more sin, was deception and lying. And that obviously was not good for his relationship with God. David wasn't a perfect man. Yes, he was a man after God's own heart, but there were times when he did things that are almost unimaginable. But he was just a human. And we need to understand as humans, we need to look at his example and understand how he got into the situation that he was, what caused it, what were the results of it, learn from that, and help to avoid some of the same mistakes in our lives. You know, doubt is a very dangerous human weakness. It's a weakness that appeals to the flesh of mankind. And it can cause us problems. It can cause other people all kinds of problems too. Doubt can lead to distrust despite the declarations that God gives us in His Word. You know, when we start lacking confidence and trust in what God says and we start doubting, then we're going to map out, we're going to go our own direction in life. And usually when that happens, it just messes everything up, or it runs into problems that we just didn't anticipate. And it often leads us deeper into sin, into more sin, just like David. David's deeper sin was deception. It was lying. It was intentionally duping other people. That could be it. It could be any number of things. But nothing good comes from doubt. And if you think back to that example of God's children in the book of Hebrews, doubt can ultimately keep us from entering the promised land. It kept Israel of old from entering there, and it can do that for us today too. Friends, maybe there's one here this morning who's not yet a child of God. The invitation is open for you now to become one. If you've already obeyed the gospel, but you've not been living faithfully, or you need the prayers of the church on your behalf in any way, we'd encourage you that you please come forward while together we all stand and sing.